Why did the guards look at her like she didn't belong there? The question lingered in the air as Arden Vale stepped off the transport, boots touching the dust with quiet certainty. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply stood for a moment, letting the heat settle against her skin, letting the noise of the forward operating base wash over her like static. Radios crackled. Engines idled. Men shouted half-orders that never quite sounded calm. She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag on her shoulder. Plain, worn, unremarkable. Just like she intended. She was here to see her husband. That was all. Paperwork approved. Clearance granted. A temporary visitor in a place that thrived on permanence and control. Still, the guards watched her the way soldiers watch something fragile near a blast zone. One of them took her ID, squinting at it longer than necessary. Another leaned back, arms crossed, eyes traveling over her jeans, her faded shirt, the lack of insignia or rank. A civilian, a complication. Secondary check, the sergeant muttered, already reaching for her bag. The zipper opened. Her life spilled onto a folding table under the sun, a paperback book, clothes neatly folded, hygiene items lined up like evidence. The guard flipped through the book, bending the spine until it cracked, then dropped it into the dirt with a careless flick. The men laughed. Arden didn't. She crouched slowly, picked the book up, brushed the sand away with deliberate care. Not rushed, not angry, just controlled. The kind of control that comes from years of knowing when not to react. Inside the base, the disrespect became louder. Eyes followed her. Comments landed just close enough to hear. Not fear, not suspicion, something worse. Dismissal. Someone called her Barbie. Someone else joked about souvenirs. Another spat tobacco juice near her boot just to see if she'd flinch. She didn't. Her breathing stayed slow. Her posture stayed neutral. But her mind was working, cataloging everything: unsecured weapons, poor spacing, men standing where they shouldn't. Sloppy. Dangerous. The command tent smelled like sweat and impatience. Major Havel noticed her immediately. His laugh was sharp, public. "We running a bed and breakfast now." Arden met his eyes without blinking. "I'm here to see my husband." The room chuckled. Havel waved her aside like furniture, left her standing in the heat. No chair, no water. She didn't ask. Instead, she studied the map behind him. Outdated, incomplete, a ridge mislabeled, a dry wash ignored. Mistakes that buried men. A corporal bumped into her, spilling coffee down her sleeve, then snapped at her like it was her fault. The tent went quiet, waiting for the civilian meltdown. It didn't come. "You missed a spot," she said flatly, pointing at the puddle by his boot. Something shifted then, not respect but unease. Lieutenant Pike made it worse. He smiled too wide, talked too loud, picked on her shoes, her clothes, her presence. At one point he shoved a sniper rifle into her chest, daring her to drop it. She caught it one-handed. Perfectly. Just for a fraction of a second, long enough for muscle memory to betray her, before she pretended to struggle, handing it back with an awkward smile. Pike laughed, satisfied. He never noticed she'd already spotted the fault in his scope mount. Caleb arrived moments later. Her husband, her anchor. His relief at seeing her softened into tension when he felt the air around them. He apologized with his eyes. She squeezed his hand once, gently. It wasn't the time. It never was. The jokes continued. The bets. How long before she cried, before she begged to leave? Arden watched a hawk circle overhead instead, calculating wind drift without thinking. When the briefing began, she stayed silent until Havel pointed at the ridge and called it secure. Her voice cut through the tent like a clean incision. "The wash behind that sector. If it's dry, it's a funnel." Laughter exploded. "Housewife steak joke, sit down." She did. But her jaw tightened, because her husband was walking into that gap. and no one was listening. The first shot cracked the air like a snapped bone. Arden moved before the sound finished echoing. She yanked Caleb down behind cover as the round buried itself where his head had been. Chaos erupted. Men scrambled. Pike panicked. "How did you know?" someone shouted. "Lucky guess," she said. But her eyes were already searching the horizon. She saw the glint. 3 kilometers out, high ground, wrong ridge. She memorized the coordinates and said nothing. Because no one would hear her now. They shoved her into the bunker minutes later, confiscated her bag, locked the door. Civilians don't belong in the mix. The bunker smelled like fear. People cried, prayed, rocked back and forth. Arden stood still, listening. Counting. When she tapped the wall in an old rhythm, a voice answered through static. Obsidian Veil, solo activation. The response came instantly. Confirmed. Above ground, the ambush hit hard. Caleb's team was pinned. No overwatch, no eyes. Havel screamed into the radio. From the bunker, Arden bent wire, slipped the lock, retrieved her bag. The rifle came together in her hands like it had been waiting. By the time she reached the west watchtower, her heart rate had dropped into a calm that frightened doctors and comforted killers. Through the scope, the world simplified. Targets, angles, wind. She saw her husband. She saw the enemy commander lifting a radio. She didn't hesitate. The shot ended the attack before it began. Then another. Then another. Silence followed. Who fired? Havel demanded. No one answered. Arden descended the ladder as authority collapsed around her. High command came through the radio like judgment. Havel was relieved. Pike shrank. Apologies died in throats. Caleb stared at her, awe and hurt tangled together. "I'm still your wife," she said softly. Later, as elite operators formed a protective ring around her, the base watched in stunned quiet. The woman they mocked picked up her canvas bag. She didn't look back. Sometimes strength doesn't announce itself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the silence feel heavier than the insults? Arden felt it as she walked beside Caleb, that strange weight that settles when something important is being deliberately ignored. The base hummed around them, boots on gravel, radios chirping, engines coughing to life. But underneath it all was a kind of tension that had nothing to do with the enemy outside the wire. It was the tension of people certain they were right, so certain they'd stopped listening. Caleb talked as they walked, about patrol schedules, about how little sleep anyone was getting, about a near miss 2 nights ago that still sat behind his eyes like a bruise. His voice was calm, practiced, the voice of a man used to carrying responsibility without letting it show. Arden listened, nodding at the right moments, smiling when he tried to lighten the tone. To anyone watching, they looked like any other couple stealing minutes together in a hostile place. But her fingers tapped lightly against the fence wire as they passed the perimeter, a habit she hadn't been able to break. Not anxiety, calculation. "You okay?" Caleb asked quietly, glancing at her hand. "I'm fine," she said, and it wasn't a lie. Fine didn't mean relaxed. Fine meant contained. They stopped near a shaded patch where the ground dipped slightly, a spot soldiers used when they wanted to talk without feeling like they were on display. Caleb leaned back against a barrier, stretching his shoulders, and for a moment the hard lines of command softened. He looked like the man she knew from home, the one who forgot to replace the coffee filter, the one who always double-checked the door at night even in the safest neighborhoods. "I hate that you saw all that," he said after a pause. "The comments, the attitude." Arden shrugged. "I've heard worse." "I know, but," he exhaled, "this place does things to people. They get loud, defensive." She looked at him then, really looked. The faint cut on his cheek he hadn't mentioned. The way his eyes kept flicking toward the ridgeline even as he spoke. He was tired, focused, doing his job the only way he knew how. You trust them? She asked. Caleb hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Enough. I trust the team, he said carefully. I don't always trust the noise. She nodded. That was honest, more honest than most people managed. A burst of laughter erupted nearby. Pike again. Always Pike. He was holding court with a cluster of younger operators, retelling some story that painted himself as the hero. His voice carried easily, sharp and confident, the kind that demanded attention even when it didn't deserve it. Hey, one of the soldiers said loudly, nodding toward Arden. Your wife got a death wish standing out here. Caleb stiffened. Arden felt it through the air between them before he spoke. She's fine, Caleb said, tone clipped. Pike grinned. Relax, man, just looking out, wouldn't want her catching a stray. Arden met Pike's eyes across the space. She didn't glare. She didn't smile. She simply looked at him the way she'd once been taught to look at a problem: assess, measure, dismiss. Pike looked away first, scoffing as if bored, but his laughter lost some of its edge. They didn't notice the wind shift. Arden did. It came subtle, brushing across the back of her neck, stirring dust in a way that didn't match the flags near the range. She glanced toward the ridgeline again, the same place Havel had called secure, the same place her mind kept returning to, uninvited. You're thinking again, Caleb said softly, half a smile. I never stopped, she replied. Before he could ask what she meant, a sharp crack split the air. Not close enough to register as impact, not distant enough to dismiss. A sound that lived in the dangerous space between. The base froze. Hands went to weapons. Voices cut off mid-sentence. Someone swore. Someone else laughed nervously, already convincing themselves it was nothing. Arden was moving before the echo faded. She grabbed Caleb's vest and pulled him down hard behind the nearest sandbag wall. He barely had time to react before a round tore through the space where his head had been, punching into the dirt with a flat, ugly thud. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Then chaos detonated. Contact. Where the hell did that come from? Lock it down. Caleb twisted to look at her, eyes wide. How did you? Down, she said, pressing him lower as more men scrambled for cover. Pike ducked behind a vehicle, breathing fast, rifle swinging wildly. Havel stormed out of the command tent, radio already barking orders that overlapped and contradicted each other. Sniper fire, someone yelled. Perimeter breach possible. Arden's gaze cut through the confusion, locking onto the horizon. She ignored the shouting, the running, the panic. Her world narrowed to angles and distances, to light and shadow. There, a faint glimmer, not movement, reflection. 3 kilometers out, high ground, exactly where she'd warned them. Her jaw tightened. She opened her mouth, ready to call it out, to give them the bearing, the elevation, the solution. But Havel shoved past her, nearly knocking her sideways. Get out of the way, he barked. You're blocking the lane. She swallowed the words. Not because they weren't true. Because they wouldn't be heard. They herded her toward the bunker moments later, hands rougher now, voices sharper. Pike grabbed her arm, fingers digging in like he needed the contact to prove something. Come on, princess, he said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. Time to hide where you belong. She pulled free, eyes cold. Touch me again, she said quietly, and you'll regret it. For a second he didn't move. Then he scoffed and stepped back, but the color had drained from his face. The bunker door slammed shut behind her, metal echoing like a verdict. Inside, the air was thick with fear. 2 clerks huddled together, whispering prayers. A contractor rocked back and forth, hands clamped over his ears as if that might keep the war out. Arden sat on the bench, hands folded, posture calm. She listened. Not just to the muffled gunfire above, but to the rhythm of it, the cadence, the pauses. She distinguished calibers by sound, distances by delay. Somewhere overhead, men were making decisions too late. "We're going to die," the contractor whimpered. Arden looked at him, really looked. "Not today," she said. Something in her voice made him stop rocking. She stood and walked to the door, fingers tracing the hinges, feeling for weaknesses. She remembered cataloging them earlier, when they'd shoved her inside like luggage. Outside, the battle escalated. She heard Caleb's voice faintly through the structure, shouting orders that were swallowed by noise. She heard Havel yelling for sniper support that didn't exist. She heard Pike screaming into the radio, his bravado gone, replaced by raw panic. No Overwatch. Exactly what the enemy had planned. Arden closed her eyes for a moment, not in prayer but in decision. She tapped the wall near the vent, 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. An old rhythm, a dead one. Silence answered at first. Then faintly, a tap returned. Her breath steadied. She leaned close to the vent. "Obsidian Veil," she whispered, "solo activation." Static hissed, then a voice calm and precise, stripped of emotion. "Confirmed, stand by." She stepped back, heart rate slowing, the fear around her receding into background noise. This wasn't panic. This was preparation. Above them, the ambush tightened. Caleb's team was pinned in an open courtyard, bullets kicking dust into the air around them like angry insects. The enemy commander raised a radio on the ridge, smiling as he spoke, already tasting victory. And Arden Vale listened. She listened to the timing, to the gaps, to the moment when waiting would become failure. She reached for the bent wire on the shelf, already working the lock as if she'd never done anything else. The door gave with a soft click. No alarms, no shouts. She slipped out into the chaos, retrieving her bag from the unsecured locker as if the base itself had finally grown careless enough to let her pass. Somewhere behind her, the bunker occupants stared, too stunned to speak. They didn't know, they just watched a line get crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. And above them all, the ridge waited. How did she move through the chaos without anyone seeing her? Arden stepped out into the open as if she belonged there, as if the base hadn't dissolved into confusion and shouted commands. Smoke drifted low, stinging her eyes. Boots thundered past her in every direction. Radios screamed overlapping reports that no one was fully processing. In the noise and urgency, no one questioned a woman moving with purpose. They were too busy reacting to notice intent. She kept her head down, pace steady, not running. Running drew attention. Her canvas bag bumped lightly against her hip as she crossed behind a row of vehicles toward the west watchtower. The structure rose above the base like a forgotten afterthought. A skeleton of metal and sandbags meant more for observation than combat. No one was assigned there. Not today. Not according to the plan that had already failed. A burst of gunfire snapped nearby, sharp and close. Arden didn't flinch. She adjusted her path by half a step, instinctively placing a concrete barrier between herself and the sound. Her breathing slowed further, each inhale measured, each exhale deliberate. This was the moment she had been avoiding. She reached the base of the tower and paused, listening. The ladder rattled faintly in the wind. No voices, no movement. Above her, the sky stretched pale and merciless, the sun flattening shadows and making distance deceptive. She opened her bag. What emerged didn't look like much at first. Separate pieces, matte black metal wrapped in cloth, components that could pass as harmless junk to an untrained eye. To her hands, they were familiar, comforting. She assembled the rifle with quiet efficiency. Stock locked into place, barrel seated and tightened, optic mounted with a precision that bordered on reverence. Her fingers moved without hesitation, guided by muscle memory older than her marriage, older than the name she now carried. This wasn't a weapon you learned to use. It was one you earned. When she slung it across her shoulder and started up the ladder, the world narrowed. Halfway up, she paused. Not because of fear, because of thought. Caleb's face flickered through her mind. The way he'd smiled when she arrived, the confusion in his eyes when she'd pulled him down, the trust he'd built in her without ever knowing the full weight of it. She climbed anyway. At the top, she eased the hatch open and slipped into position, body flattening instinctively against the platform. The tower smelled of old dust and sun-baked metal. The sandbags were poorly stacked, leaving small gaps, imperfections she'd learned to exploit long ago. She settled in, and the battlefield revealed itself. Through the scope, everything slowed. Noise faded into something distant and irrelevant. Her pulse dropped, steady and low, each beat falling into rhythm with the sway of the rifle. She adjusted for wind first. North to south drift, slight, inconsistent, the flags near the range were lying. She adjusted for distance, then for elevation, then for the fact that the enemy wasn't where Havel thought they were. She found the commander easily. He stood tall on the ridge, radio in hand, body language loose with confidence. Men like that always revealed themselves. They liked to be seen, liked to believe they were untouchable. She watched him speak, his mouth forming words that would send mortars into the courtyard where Caleb's team was pinned down, where men were already running low on ammunition and time. Her finger rested on the trigger. 2 pounds of pressure. That was all it ever took. But she didn't fire yet. She waited, because there was more at stake than a clean shot. She scanned left. An RPG gunner shifting position, trying to line up a firing lane. Nervous, rushed, dangerous. She scanned right. A spotter prone behind a low wall, optics trained on the command tent. Patient, methodical, waiting for someone important to step into the open. 3 threats. 3 lives that would end if she did nothing. She exhaled slowly, emptying her lungs completely. The first shot cracked the air like a hammer striking glass. The commander dropped mid-word, the bullet punching through the radio in his hand before tearing through his chest. The device shattered, fragments spinning uselessly as his body folded backward out of sight. Before the echo finished, Arden was already shifting. The second shot came less than a second later. The RPG gunner never saw it. The round struck the launcher, igniting the rocket in its tube. The explosion was sudden and violent, a brief fireball that erased the position entirely. The third shot followed almost immediately. The spotter's head snapped back, his scope shattering as he collapsed behind the wall. The threat ended before he could even react. 3 shots. 3 precise corrections. 1 impossible sequence. Down in the courtyard, the effect was immediate. Gunfire stuttered, then faltered. Men lifted their heads cautiously, disbelief spreading as they realized the pressure had vanished. Radios crackled with confused reports. Targets down. Who the hell? Where did that come from? Havel burst out of the command tent, binoculars already raised, scanning wildly. Who fired? He shouted. Report. No one answered. Because no one knew. Pike stared up at the ridgeline, mouth hanging open, his rifle forgotten in the dust beside him. The shots hadn't sounded like anything he recognized. Too clean, too fast, too deliberate. That wasn't us, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. That angle, no way. Caleb pushed himself up behind cover, heart hammering, eyes searching for the source. He followed the line of smoke back to the ridge, then down toward the tower. The west watchtower. The one that had been empty. The hatch at the top shifted. A figure emerged. Arden didn't rush her descent. She slung the rifle and climbed down with the same measured calm she'd carried all day. By the time her boots hit the ground, Havel and half the base were converging on her position. You, Havel barked, face flushed with equal parts rage and disbelief. What the hell do you think you're doing? She set the rifle down carefully, not surrendering it, placing it. It was necessary, she said. The radio on Havel's chest crackled before he could respond. Stand down, a voice commanded, cold, absolute. Protect the Omega sniper at all costs. The color drained from Havel's face. He stared at the rifle, at the subtle engraving along the receiver, a name he recognized only from rumors and closed-door briefings. Obsidian Vale. Men around him straightened unconsciously, salutes snapping up without orders. Even those who didn't fully understand felt the shift, the sudden gravity of what stood before them. Pike's head bowed. His apology came out in a rush, barely coherent. Arden didn't acknowledge it. Caleb approached slowly, eyes never leaving her face. Arden, he said quietly, what is this? She met his gaze, the weight of years sitting between them. I'm still your wife, she said. I just had to make a choice. Another shot rang out from the ridge. A straggler, late, desperate. Arden turned, raised the rifle and fired once more. The threat collapsed. Silence followed. Real silence. In that quiet, something settled over the base. Not triumph, not celebration, but understanding. They had underestimated the wrong person. And some mistakes couldn't be undone. As the elite extraction team arrived, forming a protective ring around her, Arden picked up her canvas bag. The same one they'd searched, mocked, kicked into the dirt. She slung it over her shoulder. Caleb walked beside her, still processing, still struggling to reconcile the woman he loved with the force he'd just witnessed. She didn't explain. Some truths didn't need defending. They only needed to be lived. What do you say to someone when the ground under your life has shifted? Caleb didn't ask any questions as they walked toward the transport staging area. Not yet. The base had gone quiet in the way places do after violence has passed through and taken something with it. Men moved slower. Voices dropped. No one laughed. A few stared openly as Arden passed, eyes following the rifle now secured by operators who treated it with careful distance, as if it were something sacred or dangerous enough to bite. She felt the weight of their looks, but it no longer pressed against her chest. It slid off harmless. The elite team moved around her in a loose perimeter, efficient and silent. Their presence created a corridor through the base, one that no one dared step into. Havel stood off to the side, stripped of his authority in a way that didn't require ceremony. His shoulders slumped. He didn't speak. There was nothing left for him to say. Pike lingered near a vehicle, staring at the ground. The loudness that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by something smaller. When Arden passed, he opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, something better, but no words came. She didn't look at him. Caleb finally broke the silence when they reached the edge of the staging area. How long? He asked quietly. Arden didn't pretend not to understand. Before we met, she said, before I stopped. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. And you never told me. No. Why? She considered the question as the rotors of a distant helicopter began to thrum. Because it wasn't who I wanted to be anymore, she said. And because I didn't want it to become who you saw when you looked at me. Caleb stopped walking. The operators halted with him, sensing the shift but not interfering. The world seemed to narrow again, not into a battlefield this time, but into the fragile space between two people who loved each other and were suddenly standing on opposite sides of a truth. You let me think I was the one protecting you, he said. There was no accusation in his voice, just hurt. Arden met his eyes. I let you be who you needed to be. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. All this time, was it real, us? That was the only real part, she said without hesitation. The certainty in her voice steadied him more than any explanation could have. He looked at her hands then. They were still, not shaking, not bloodied. The same hands that packed his gear, that held his face when nightmares woke him at night. Hands that had ended lives without hesitation, when there was no other choice. "I should be angry," he said after a long pause. "I know. I'm not," he admitted. "I'm just trying to understand where I fit now." She stepped closer, not to comfort him, to be honest. "You fit where you always have, beside me, not in front, not behind." The helicopter touched down, wind whipping dust into the air. The operators moved with purpose, loading equipment, checking angles. One of them approached Arden and handed her a set of ear protection. The gesture was respectful, professional. She took it, nodding once. As they prepared to board, Havel finally found his voice. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly, not meeting her eyes, "for my conduct for today." Arden studied him for a moment, not with anger, with clarity. "Apologies don't change outcomes," she said. "They change patterns, decide which one matters to you." He swallowed, nodding sharply. The helicopter lifted them away from the base, the sprawl of tents and barriers shrinking beneath them. From the air it looked smaller, less imposing, just another temporary mark on unforgiving land. Caleb watched it disappear, then turned to her. "What happens now?" "For them," she said, "reviews, reports, careers that stall." "And for you?" She looked out the open side of the helicopter, wind tugging at her hair. "I go back to being quiet." He smiled faintly at that. "You were never quiet." "No," she agreed, "I was careful." The flight stretched on, the hum of the rotors filling the spaces where words might have been. Caleb leaned back, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Arden stayed alert, eyes scanning out of habit, even though the danger had passed. She thought about the people in the bunker, the fear in their eyes. The moment they'd realized she wasn't what they thought, she wondered what story they'd tell later, about the civilian wife, about the woman who changed when the door locked. Stories always simplified things. They landed at a forward airstrip as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised colors. The operators disembarked first, securing the area. One of them paused in front of Arden, snapping a salute that carried weight. "Good to see you again," he said quietly. She returned it with precision. "It won't be long," she replied. He smiled. "It never is." When they were alone again, Caleb finally reached for her hand. His grip was tentative at first, then firm. "I don't know how to explain this to myself yet," he said. "You don't have to," she replied. "Just don't turn it into distance." He nodded, squeezing her hand once. They sat together as the last light faded, the adrenaline draining away, leaving behind the quieter injuries. The ones no medics treated, the ones you carried. Later, in the stillness of a temporary quarters, Caleb slept. Arden sat awake, cleaning a fleck of dust from her boot with the edge of a cloth. A small, ordinary task, a reminder. She thought about the shot, not the act of pulling the trigger but the moment before it, the choice, the line she'd crossed again after promising herself she wouldn't. She knew she'd carry that weight. But she also knew this. Some vows are spoken. Others are kept in silence under fire when no one is watching. And sometimes, love looks like taking the shot so someone else never has to. What happens after the adrenaline fades and the silence gets too loud? Morning came without ceremony. No alarms, no shouting, just the pale, uncertain light creeping through the thin curtains of the temporary quarters. Arden was already awake. She had been for a while, lying still, listening to the sounds of a place that pretended it was at peace. Boots outside, a distant engine, the soft rustle of fabric as someone shifted in their sleep. Caleb lay beside her, one arm thrown across his chest, breathing deep and slow. For the first time since she'd arrived, his face looked unguarded, younger. She watched him for a moment longer than necessary, memorizing the lines she usually took for granted. This was the part no one ever talked about. Not the shot, not the explosion, the morning after. She slipped out of bed quietly and dressed, movements economical, familiar. Jeans, shirt. the same clothes that had made everyone underestimate her. She pulled her boots on and stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the smell of dust and fuel. The base had shifted overnight. Men moved with a different kind of awareness now, quieter. Eyes tracked more carefully. When they saw her, conversation stopped. Not out of mockery this time, but uncertainty. She wasn't sure which felt worse. Near the mess area, a small group stood around a makeshift table, talking in low voices. One of them noticed her and nudged the others. The conversation died instantly. "Ma'am," one said finally, awkward and stiff. Arden nodded once and kept walking. She found a spot near the perimeter where the ground sloped gently upward, overlooking the same ridgeline that had almost swallowed the base the day before. In daylight, it looked harmless, empty, like a place nothing important had ever happened. She knew better. She sat on a concrete barrier and let the sun warm her face. For the first time since the ambush, she allowed herself to feel it, the weight she'd been holding back. Not guilt exactly, not regret, something more complex. Responsibility. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't turn. "I figured I'd find you out here," Caleb said. She smiled faintly. "You always do." He sat beside her, leaving a careful space between them. Not distance, respect. "They're already talking," he said. "Rumors, stories. Half of them don't know what to think." "And the other half?" she asked. "They're trying to rewrite yesterday in a way that makes them comfortable." She nodded. "That's normal." Caleb watched the ridgeline for a long moment. "I keep replaying it," he admitted. "That second before you pulled me down, if you hadn't." "But I did," she said gently. He turned to her then. "You saved my life." She didn't answer right away. "I prevented a loss," she said. "There's a difference." He frowned slightly, not sure he understood. "Saving implies something heroic," she continued. "I wasn't being brave, I was being precise." The honesty of it unsettled him more than false humility would have. Later that morning, an inquiry team arrived. Crisp uniforms, neutral expressions. They asked questions in quiet rooms and took notes without reacting. Arden answered what she could, what she was allowed. Some things remained unsaid, locked behind layers of clearance and older promises. One of the officers studied her carefully. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She thought about the enemy commander's face in the scope, the radio in his hand, the timing. "No," she said, "but I don't celebrate it either." He nodded, writing something down. Outside, she passed Pike near the motor pool. He stiffened when he saw her, then squared his shoulders as if bracing himself. "I wanted to say," he began, voice rough, "I was wrong about you, about everything." She stopped, turning to face him fully. "I know," she said. He blinked, caught off guard. "You do." "I knew yesterday," she replied, "the moment you panicked." The words weren't cruel, they were factual. Pike flushed, shame coloring his face. "I'm trying to do better." "Then do better," she said. "Not for me, for the people who trust you." She walked away before he could respond. By afternoon, preparations were underway for her departure. The elite operators waited without urgency, patient and unassuming. One of them handed her back the rifle, disassembled, wrapped carefully. She took it, fingers brushing the metal, familiar, heavy. "You don't have to carry it anymore," the operator said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but I will." Caleb stood nearby, watching. He looked at the rifle, then at her. "Does it ever go away?" he asked. "That part of you?" "No," she said. "It just learns when to sleep." They boarded the transport as the sun dipped again, the base receding behind them. This time, there was no spectacle, no stares, just a quiet understanding that something irreversible had passed through that place. As the landscape rolled by beneath them, Caleb leaned his head back, eyes closed. "I used to think strength was about standing your ground," he said softly. "And now?" she asked. Now I think it's about knowing when to move without being seen." She smiled, a small, tired thing. When the transport touched down at the next stop, the world felt oddly normal, too normal. People went about their routines. Laughter drifted from somewhere. Life continued indifferent. Arden stepped onto the tarmac and felt the familiar pull of anonymity settle back over her like a cloak. She welcomed it. Before they parted, Caleb stopped her, hands resting on her shoulders. "Whatever comes next," he said, "I want to face it with you, no more halves." She met his gaze, seeing the resolve there. "Then you have to accept all of me," she said, "even the parts that scare you." He nodded, "Especially those." As she walked away with the operators, Arden didn't look back. Not because she didn't care, but because she'd learned long ago that the past only had power if you kept feeding it. Some lives are loud. Others leave their mark quietly, in decisions made when no one is cheering. And the truest measure of strength is carrying what you've done, without letting it define everything you are. What do you do when the world finally stops asking for your strength? The answer didn't come right away. Weeks later, Arden stood in a quiet place far from dust and gunfire, watching morning light spill across a kitchen counter. The house was small, ordinary, the kind of place no one would ever look twice at, a safe place. She'd chosen it that way. Caleb was still asleep down the hall. His breathing was steady now, no longer fractured by sudden wakes or half-formed commands. The war hadn't left him untouched, but it had loosened its grip. Slowly, carefully. She poured coffee and leaned against the counter, listening to the silence. Real silence. The kind that didn't buzz with anticipation. The kind that let thoughts surface without dragging fear along with them. This was supposed to be the easy part. But ease felt unfamiliar. People assumed the hard moments were the shots, the missions, the split-second decisions. They rarely understood that the true test came afterward, when there were no orders to follow, no threat to focus the mind. Just space, just memory. Arden stepped outside, mug warming her hands. The yard was still, grass wet with dew. Somewhere nearby, a bird called out, unbothered by anything larger than its next meal. She closed her eyes briefly and breathed. Not to calm herself. To check. Her pulse was normal, her shoulders relaxed. She wasn't scanning rooftops or calculating distances. For the first time in a long while, nothing in her demanded action. Later that morning, she met Caleb on the porch. He leaned against the railing, coffee in hand, watching her with that familiar mix of curiosity and affection. "You okay?" he asked. She smiled, "I think so." He nodded, accepting that for what it was. They learned not to force certainty where it didn't exist. Life settled into a rhythm that didn't announce itself. Grocery trips, evenings on the couch, small arguments about nothing that mattered. The extraordinary faded back into the background where it belonged. Sometimes, though, the past found its way in. A news report about a distant conflict, a sharp sound that made her pause mid-step, a stranger's careless joke about war, spoken without malice or understanding. She never corrected them. Not because she didn't care, but because she no longer needed to be seen. One afternoon, months later, a letter arrived. No return address. Heavy paper, official without being threatening. She opened it alone, standing by the window. It thanked her. Not for the shots. For the restraint. For waiting as long as she had. For acting only when there was no other path left. For leaving quietly. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer she rarely opened. Some acknowledgments weren't meant to be displayed. That night she sat beside Caleb on the back steps, watching the sun sink low. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked suddenly. She knew what he meant. "No," she said after a moment. "I miss who I was before I needed it." He considered that, then nodded. "I think I understand." She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the simple weight of him there. Alive, present. In another life, she might have stayed hidden forever. In another version of the story, she might have been remembered only as a footnote in someone else's after-action report. But this life, the one she'd chosen, was quieter. And that was the point. She still noticed things others missed. She still carried herself with that same steadiness that had once unsettled an entire base. But now, those traits served a different purpose. They made her a good neighbor, a reliable friend, a woman who knew when to listen. Strength, she'd learned, wasn't about being ready to act at any moment. It was about knowing you could, and choosing not to. On an evening when the air turned cool and the stars came out one by one, Arden stood in the doorway and watched Caleb laugh at something trivial. The sound surprised her. It always did. She realized then that the shot she'd taken months ago hadn't just saved lives. It had ended a chapter. Not with glory, not with applause, but with dignity. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.